One of the best tractors ever built. I'm going to tell you what it is, and I'm going to tell you why I think this. So, Tier 3 Case CVX, or Steyr, or New Holland TVT, whichever colour it is, they're all exactly the same, and they're all brilliant. Okay, let's start talking hydraulics first, because why not? Nobody ever talks about the hydraulics of these things. It's probably a very boring thing about them. So, variable displacement pump, so power beyond was an option. And interestingly, the hydraulic oil tank was sandwiched between the engine and the transmission. So the casting between the engine and transmission was your hydraulic oil tank. Some will say it lacked enough oil to tip some of the larger trailers, and they're probably right. But what was a bonus on this is it didn't matter what cross-contamination there was on oil between your tractors, or whether there was brakes failing on another tractor and their oil was messing up. It didn't mess up the rest of the transmission. So the oil in the hydraulic system never mixed with the transmission, unless something, no, it wouldn't happen. The only thing that would happen with them is, if you imagine you've got this great big casting between the engine and the transmission, with your shaft from the engine to transmission going through it, and then you had like a plastic cone in the middle, which was the barrier to stop the oil dripping out, and the seals on each end of this would go, and you'd get some very, very confusing phone calls from people where they'd go, something very odd wrong with my CVX. There's oil leaking out of the starter motor, and you think, why on earth would there be oil in the starter motor? And that was what would happen. They'd be essentially filling up the bell housing with oil until it dripped out the end of the starter motor. So back in the late 90s, you've got Steyr with ZF, and you've got Fendt, both battling to be the first out there with a fully vario tractor transmission, or fully variable. I shouldn't use the term variable because that is Fendt's term. This is a variable stepless transmission, so you can be any RPM at any speed, no gears, just straight through. This is what they decided the market wanted, for fuel efficiency, and for ease of use, especially in sort of slower speed, sort of veg growing conditions and draft. It's a transmission that's absolutely. It's interestingly, the entire industry hasn't decided that this is the way to go. We still take power shifts and we still make synchro mesh, but this has become an absolute staple transmission throughout the industry in every tractor brand now. So back 25 years ago, it was a very new thing, and this tractor was developed between Steyr and ZF to be their answer to it. So Carraro front axle, either suspended or unsuspended, or braked or unbraked, depending on your spec. Sisu engine, so an engine coming out of Finland, same as a Valtra. This is pre Agco buying that engine, and then ZF transmission, Bosch hydraulic pump. Okay, front axle was made by Carraro. The triple link suspended front axle was the most common in the UK by far. This axle is a bit of Marmite, I do understand, but back then it was it's still an incredibly comfortable axle compared to like the saddle type fitted to the CNHs now. That was a very comfortable transmission on the road. It was very good axle. It did require a lot of maintenance. If you check out my channel on TikTok, I have done a full video talking about this axle, and I can do on this, to be fair. So I need to relax and sort of slow down and calm down a bit. This is YouTube, not TikTok. I'm not doing a 3-minute video. I'm doing it as long as it takes, I suppose. This, by the way, is a power pack, they call it. When you used to go to a Case conference back in the day, you'd get handed these to show you what products were coming and all the spec information and everything you need to sell against another tractor and to spec up in front of a customer. They were very handy, no nonsense, and you also got a CD in the front, so you could plug it into your laptop. Not that any laptops have CD drives anymore, or disk drives. and you'd have all the information there to hand. So yeah, front axle was a Carraro, braked in the hubs, and then a diff lock in the front. What did used to fail on them is diff lock seals, where you would know that this happened because it would fill the front differential casing with hydraulic oil from the back, and then start leaking out the breather. And this was a big job. Stripping that axle was not a fun job at all, so we try to avoid it as much as we can. This one pictured front linkage and front PTO, which was obviously an option. What I did like on a Case CVX is if you had any extras like this, it was literally plug and play. Whereas a Puma or a T7000 or a New Holland or a Massey or anything like that, you would have to plug these in and then go and configure the computer to tell it it's got it. With the CVX, you just plugged them in and it knew. It all just worked. The electronics were very different to anything else we ever dealt with, but they just did seem to work. Maybe a little bit crude. For instance, diagnosing a electrical fault on these, you had two main relays, ignition 1 and ignition 2, and you'd work out that half the things weren't working, and you could very easily link that back to ignition 1 or ignition 2, and it made electrical diagnostics a lot easier on them. Yeah, but very different. Anything Fiat or CNH, it was a very different style of schematic, but I certainly got on all right with them. And then you'd have three fuse boards, so one under the engine cover, one under the dashboard in like a clip that looks like a glove box, and then one up inside the roof panel there. Brakes. So it was often said that the brakes on a S-Matic were never good enough to fail, and there's probably something in that. But on the back of that, the transmission brake was very good, maybe too good, because we did have a few cases of the engine over revving because people were holding back too much on the transmission and not using the brakes. There was also the risk of pulling back on the transmission and causing a jackknife with your trailer because you're not pressing your brake. A good operator would be pressing and holding the shift button, which would hold the transmission ratio in order for you to use your foot brake in order to use the transmission, the trailer brake. But not everybody knew how to do that. Interesting enough, I was discussing this with another dealer, with Ian Mills from Western Farm Services a couple of weeks ago, and we were discussing this tractor and what made it so good. And I said, isn't it interesting that every tractor with a variable transmission before or since, you've always had to have a moving joystick. You've always either had to have a slider, like on a John Deere, it's got the little slider with the thumb wheel, or the Fendt, which has got a joystick which you tap forward, or a Case, where a Puma, where you've got to slide the lever forward. And yet, somehow, this was one of the most responsive and easy to drive variable transmissions with no moving parts. You had three buttons. You had an up, down, and a hold. And yet, somehow, it really, really worked. It did. It was very responsive. The power was there when you want it, especially on road work and potato work. It always seemed to keep momentum and keep going. You know, it was a really, really good tractor. Transmission. Let me talk the main difference between Fendt Vario and the ZF transmission. So Fendt Vario at this time was a 2x1, so two ranges forward, one range reverse, using a really, really clever hydrostat which could move both your motor and your pump swash angle through 45 degrees by moving your pump body itself. And so this meant you had a huge range in travel and speed without moving range. So you didn't need gears moving inside the gearbox as you're going. You didn't need to do anything like that because you had this hydrostat, which had this incredible range of travel. Well, ZF did it a different way. So this is what ZF did, had 4 ranges, or 4 forwards and 2 reverse ranges, but a more regular hydrostat unit. So fixed motor, variable pump, so which could move from a negative to a positive swash angle. But as it would move and as it would get a full range, your next gear would be pre-selected and it would continue on up the range, just like a dual clutch transmission that we see today. Very similar concept, except that you had this hydrostat, your hydrostat making the full variable. Now, the downfall of this, or the negative of this, if there was one, was you had a much more complicated control system in order to pre-select these gears, and also you did have points where you might feel a range change, whereas the Fendt was all the way through. But the upside of this was, at least in theory, it should have been a much more efficient transmission, because each time you change a range, you have a point in that range where you are at your maximum efficiency, whereas a Fendt or a Vario gearbox would only have this once, all the way from 0 to 50k. This transmission would have it 4 times. So the chances are, when you're going on the road, you may very well find yourself in a much more efficient point of driving, where you're not using your hydrostat fully swash angle one way or the other. Being said, I suppose it's ironic that the issues we did get with these were the stepper motors. So the stepper motor was a unit bolted to the top of the hydrostat unit, and this is what allowed the operated a small piston inside which moved your swash plate angle, and it also had a sensor on the end of it with a feedback with a ball to feed back the information back to the FMGR controller. So if you imagine you've got your hydrostat which is moving, okay, your hydrostat swash which is moving, from negative to positive angle, okay, your controller is requesting this move. So it says, I want 5 degrees. It would send the oil that it thinks it needs to move it 5 degrees, and then the sensor on the end would see that it's moved 5 degrees and feed that information back to the controller, say, yes, I've achieved that. And then one of the drawbacks was you'd get a little bit of wear at the end of this ball, in the end of this sensor, and it wouldn't know where it was. So it would get very confused because it sees a gap, and I think I'm here, but it doesn't feel like I am. And if that happened, it would literally shut down wherever you were, and you couldn't use that transmission until somebody had stripped it down, changed that tiny little stepper motor ball, although in most cases we would just change the complete stepper motor and stick it back together at great cost. By the end, they were pretty well sorted, but I remember it being interesting. If you looked at the parts diagram for that stepper motor and you clicked superseded numbers, there was something like 15 or 17 different part numbers that they'd tried before they'd got to the final one and actually got it right. So it was obviously something that had been a pretty major issue for ZF over the development of that transmission, and the next generation that came from it did not use the same sort of idea. I suppose it's worth mentioning that when I say these are brilliant tractors, I'm not, and never have been, a tractor driver. I'm not driving for a contractor. I'm not a farmer. Well, I am a farmer, but in a much, not in a scale that requires a 195 horsepower tractor. I'm coming at this from a mechanics angle because I enjoyed working on these tractors, and I saw them as incredibly strong tractors back when we were PDIing them and selling them new. I'm coming at it from a different angle, I suppose. And I still believe they're a very strong tractor that hold up today. And I think if you've got a Tier 3 CVX, there's no reason why it shouldn't hold up to anything built today. I suppose a bit of a drawback is you don't have the option of fully integrated steering or guidance, but it is something that can be done aftermarket. The same with Isobus. It's not available wasn't available as a factory fit, but it was something that you could add afterwards. When this tractor came to the end of its line, and was replaced by the Puma CVX, it was dated. The cab was dated. The cab needed an update. We always wanted CNH to keep the bare bones of this tractor, to put an FPT engine in it and an updated cab and keep going as it was. But I suppose long term it made better sense for CNH to use their own transmission, which is what they eventually did in the Puma. And I suppose that did make a lot of sense. One little nugget: if you do own a Case, if you do own a CVX Tier 2 or Tier 3, what I'd like you to do, if you don't have the follow me home feature on the lights, so when you switch the tractor on, the lights should come on and stay on for 20 or 30 seconds, which can be adjusted in the dash. If you don't have this feature on your tractor, pull the floor up, pull the plate off underneath the floor, and you'll see a little slot for a relay to sit in. And you need a 5-pin relay. Stick that in there, and all of a sudden your tractor will have that feature. I do remember thinking it was quite funny that it was an option you could tick on the list when you were being built, and probably at great cost. And the only difference was they would add that relay. And most of the tractors we sold didn't have it, but we would, if anybody wanted it, we'd stick it in on if we ever had the tractor in bits. But I just thought there were just so many little nuggets like that that I thought was great on it, and also the fact when this tractor, system pressure on this tractor was system pressure for the transmission came from a vane pump on the transmission, and this vane pump would wear, and it was all adjustable, and I just liked that you could tell it was been built by somebody who wanted us to be able to fix it efficiently. You know, it was something you put a gauge in. If they were complaining about low pressure and bringing error codes up, you'd stick a gauge in, go in there with an Allen key and turn the pressure up a bit, back up to spec. I just thought it was a brilliant little thing to work on. You know, if you got this far, make sure to if you got this far, I'm incredibly impressed with you, to be honest. Make sure to give us a like and a follow, because that all helps. And please give me some feedback in the comments, because I need to know that I'm not just doing this for me. And if there's any other other tractors you want me to go a bit more in depth on, especially the CNH stuff, I'm pretty well adapted on that stuff. Or anything else you'd like to hear an opinion on. Like I say, we do have another channel on TikTok which I'm better at, just because it's easier to knock out a 3-minute video when the kids have gone to sleep than try and do a 10 or a 15-minute video. Yeah, by all means give that a follow as well. That would be great. Yeah, hope you've enjoyed, and if you got this far, well done you. I'm very impressed.